Hey there everybody, Eric from Outer Limitless coming at you today with another video. Today's video is on how I make my Paracord lanyard wraps for my knives. Now there's all kinds of different knots and weaves that you can use for your lanyards, different design styles and ways to approach it. But today I'm going to specifically talk about the snake knot. Now, there's a couple of ways that I've approached this. I'm going to talk you through my mentality as I go through the design of a lanyard, talk about how I actually perform these knots, and what it can do for you. Now, the snake knot is one of my favorite knots for a lanyard, basically because it's a nice round profile. If you look at it here, it's very, very round, and I mean, compare that against the cobra knot, which a lot of you are probably very familiar with. The cobra knot is very flat, and so this snake knot I really do enjoy because it's round. It gives me a good extra length on my blade if I want a place to kind of grab on with a couple of fingers or my pinky to choke back on the knife. It's good and comfortable, gives me a nice solid grip, and so that's why a lot of times I do prefer this snake knot. Now, I always try to make a lanyard that somewhat color coordinates with my blade or gives me a reason to use a specific color. You can see that lately I've been using a bright orange, mainly because, I bring these blades into the woods. A lot of my blades have almost a camouflage patina to them, or, a sort of earth-colored handle scale, and so for me, just to have a little bit of a bright color on my blades helps in terms of if I put it down, just the ability to easily find it so I don't forget it. Now, one of the things to consider is whether or not you feel as though you intend on taking off your lanyard ever. And so what I mean by that, if you look at this particular blade, now this is my Wayne Walker Custom Knives bushcraft knife, and you'll notice that the way this knife was constructed, it does have pins that hold the handle scales onto the tang, and so the reality of this particular knife is that these handle scales will never come off, and so in that regard I decided my lanyard itself would never have to come off. And so you'll see the way I constructed it, the paracord is right through that lanyard hole, basically knotted around itself, and this lanyard can never come off. And so, I picked the orange for this particular reason because it ties off of this, the colors of the liners between the scales and the tang, and so it's one final presentation that in my mind doesn't ever necessarily have to change, and I'm not going to be taking these scales off, so to have a permanently fixed lanyard works perfectly fine for me. Now, it's a slightly different philosophy when you look at this Becker BK7. Basically, this particular knife has bolt-on scales, and it is possible that I would potentially want to take these scales off, and in that regard, I may also want to remove my lanyard. So you'll see the way that I made this is basically with a design that allows me to take this lanyard off. Pretty much if I just loop this back through itself and pull it all the way off, I can completely remove this lanyard. And so there's a good amount of paracord here, and I didn't want to necessarily waste it and have to cut it all the way off if I wanted to remove these scales for any reason. And so for that reason, I put the pass-through design that allows me to take this lanyard off. Now, also in a similar fashion, where this blade is more of a tactical style blade, I also decided I may not want orange on this all the time, and so if I wanted to swap this out for a darker lanyard, make this knife a little more subdued and a little less visible, I can remove this, get it completely out of the picture. I can add another lanyard if I want to, and you'll notice at the same time I do actually have a second lanyard. This is just a real basic simple lanyard that allows me to hold on to the knife for chopping tasks and keep it tight onto my hand so that I don't accidentally slip and lose my blade. The other one that I have on there is actually more for aesthetics and to add a little bit of orange to the blade so if I take it to the woods, I can find it a lot easier. Now, when I approach installing a lanyard, basically the first thing I do is I double up my paracord and I get it through the lanyard hole so that I end up with a loop. and then I just take the rest of my cord for what I'm going to weave and pull it right through that loop. And I get it nice and tight, and that's where I start my project. Now I'm going to do a couple of things here. First, I'm going to show you starting this weave on a knife, and then I'm going to do one off of the blade to show you what it would be like in a little bit closer detail to actually make the snake knot. And so for me to get started, basically I just make sure that my paracord's nice and tight up against the butt end of the tang. I know that after I make this weave, I will be able to still remove it. So this is a removable design, and this is pretty much for me the point where I get started. I'm going to show you this weave in close detail, but I'm talking about real quickly just some basic concepts. So for me, the first thing I do when I start any lanyard, I make sure that my first knot is absolutely perfect. That's the most important thing to getting this off to the right direction. And so I take my time, I get it the appropriate tightness, I make sure that it's nice and snug up against this pommel end so that it's where I want it, and that it's tight enough that this won't accidentally pop off. And so really the setup for me is the most important thing to having a successful lanyard. And now you can see my first knot up against that loop, pretty much how it looks, and that's reasonably tight. I haven't really cranked down too hard on the knot, and I'll talk to you real quick about that as well. So when you get into making your lanyard, you have to determine how tight you want your knot. I personally do not like my knots too tight. The tighter you make them, the more stiff the lanyard will be. And so if you go really, really tight with your knots, this thing will have very minimal give. Now I just do kind of like a medium tight knot. That does a couple of things. For me, it leaves this nice and flexible and pliable, and it kind of forms to my hand when I grip it. It also isn't quite so stiff if this rubs up against your gear or rubs up against you, or you have the knife in a sheath on your hip, and it makes the lanyard a little less irritating. I found that if you go way too tight with your knots, that this thing will just kind of stand out nice and proud, and at different times it can kind of poke at you or get in the way. So for me, doing a nice, I don't know, I'd call it like a medium tightness on my knots is about perfect. So now to get into the actual knot, the first thing I'm going to tell you is that if you want to make a 5-inch lanyard, you're going to need approximately 5 feet of paracord. And that's typically true for a lot of the basic weaves and knots that you're going to use for lanyards. It's basically 1 inch to 1 foot ratio. And so the other thing is, and it completely depends on what you want to do. In this particular case, I'm showing you 2 distinctly different colors of paracord so that you can see how I'm weaving this. It's a little more complicated if you're trying to do that and actually make a lanyard, because you'd have to melt and fuse the 2 pieces of paracord together. But for simplicity, in this particular case, I'm simply going to move forward with just 2 regular strands, and I knotted them together and I nailed it down just to show you the actual knot. And so anyhow, I'm going to get into this here and show you the technique. Now, like I mentioned, 2 distinctly different colors. I'll try to do my best to be careful and describe this to you. But to start the snake knot, what you're going to do is you're going to take your left hand side. So in this case, it's the blue. On the screen here, it's the lower one, but to me it is the left hand side. You're basically just going to drop it over the top of the one to the right, which in this case is the white. Bring it back around and under both of them. So you're pretty much making a circle around the entire thing. I'll do that one more time because this is really important and it's the foundation for this entire knot. Again, take the one on the left, or in this case the blue, bring it around and under the entire thing. So you're pretty much just making a loop right around it. Now from there, the next step is you're going to take the right hand cord, or in this case the white, you're going to bring it underneath the one that you just wrapped around, over the top of all of that and down and through the loop that you made. And on both of these, you're going to take up all the slack, and you'll see it's starting to form almost like a pretzel or a square knot. And you're going to pull that all the way up until you get that all the way to the top to your prior knot. And this is another key, important step in making this to look right, which is your paracord can get twisted while you're working. So as you're working the knot up and tight, make sure you use your fingers and just kind of straighten out this paracord as you go, and make sure you get the twist out of it so that it cinches up real nice and tight and flush, and it's not twisted and making any sort of weirdness going up against the knot behind. And you can see I already have 2 knots started, and that's going to kind of lay out my pattern moving forward. And then you simply just continue to repeat it. And you'll notice with this particular knot, the sides and the colors stay consistent the entire time, and you're just going to continue to just go forward and repeat the process over and over and over again. So again, taking the left hand side of the blue over the top and then under the entire thing, making a loop. Then you take your right hand cord, you're going to go under the one that you just laid over the top, and down and through the loop. And again, you start to cinch that up, and you can see how it's making a square knot. Make sure you keep the loops flat so they don't twist back on themselves. You want to make sure that the loops stay with the appropriate curl, the way that you had it set up. And you just work those up nice and tight, twist out any of the paracord that may have gotten twisted up, and continue to the point where you cinch that up nice and tight to the one before. And again, that's the part of the step I was saying, you can make that knot as tight as you want. Right now, if I want, I could crank that down and tighten it really, really tight, but it's going to make my entire braid that much stiffer and have less workability. So I'm just going to go at this for a couple minutes here. I'm going to do a bunch of knots so that you can see how this thing lays itself out, and then we'll go from there. So now I have a number of knots in a row, and you can kind of see how that went. You just stay the course and keep going, and before you know it, you're done. And so at this point, I actually almost have a suitable length lanyard for a blade. I mean, I'd probably honestly only do 2 or 3 more knots, and that would be just about the right length for me. I mean, if you look at the length of it compared to my hand, it's just about the length of my pointer finger, probably. Yeah, it's just almost exactly there. And so like I said, maybe 2 or 3 more knots, and that would be about right. Now the other thing you'll notice about this particular weave that I did, it is very, very loose. And I did that on purpose so that you can see kind of what it looks like as it's looped around, and how I have my paracord nice and square. It's not twisted around. I don't have any like really hard twists in the paracord that would make it kind of funny or sitting weird. And you can see that it's pretty consistent from knot to knot to knot, and I really try to do that as best I can. This particular one's nice in the fact that there is the two-tone that you can see, you know, with both the blue and the white, so it's kind of stylish. This would be perfect for a bracelet, definitely good for a lanyard, and you could use it for a number of things, maybe zipper pulls on a bag or whatever you'd like. Now to finish these off, typically I'll make my last couple of knots really tight, just so that it can't completely loosen up and come apart on me. And then I snip the ends and melt them down and squash them flat. And that's pretty standard for paracord finishing. You know, it's not the best looking end, but at the same time, it's kind of how you do business with this stuff, and it works perfectly fine for me. And just a final thought for you guys, something that you might like. This particular knot that I made is literally identical to the one that I made on the lanyard. The real only difference being, I actually made this out of shock cord. And so you don't necessarily have to do this with just paracord. I mean, I know that's what people typically do, but I wanted to have a stylish looking shock cord on the end of my ferro rod and have the ability to affix it to my sheath. And so just another idea, giving you guys something that you can do to kind of tie this whole package together, give you the functionality that you need, and using the different materials to suit the purpose for which it's intended. You know, it comes with the territory. You really need to know how to do some of this basic stuff, but you only learn from being taught and through trying. And so if you've never tried this before, I highly suggest it. It's something that you can do in quiet time while you're watching TV. Gives you an opportunity to kind of play with your blades while you're hanging out, and it's definitely something worth knowing how to do. So there you have it. I appreciate you guys stopping by. I hope you like what you saw. I hope you found it a little bit informative. If you like what you saw, please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Take care now. I'll see you soon.